Now, for tonight's program, US-Cuba Relations, 1898 to the present, we have a speaker with us. Mr. Walt Zlotow is president of the West Suburban Peace Coalition. He has followed US-Cuba relations for 7 decades, supporting the Cuban Revolution of 1956 through 59 that overthrew the Batista regime, a government which had brutalized the Cuban people with America's backing for over 25 years. His sister-in-law is a Cuban national who immigrated to the US in 1969, marrying his brother in 1974. And Zlotow visited Cuba in 2017, which inspired him to develop tonight's talk. He blogs daily on anti-war and other subjects at heartlandprogressive.blogspot.com. Please welcome Mr. Walt Zlotow.
Christina, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to our program, US-Cuba Relations 1898 to present, what they didn't teach us in school. And in my case, my interest in, indeed fascination with US-Cuba relations goes back now 62 years. And I can tell you the exact day because it was an easy one to remember. January 1st, 1959, when the news announced that the revolutionaries under Fidel Castro had expelled the dictator Fulgencio Batista from Cuba, and the Cuban Revolution was successful, something that had actually been in the works for over 300 years. In any event, I was thrilled about his victory because just from getting information from the news, I could see that the relationship between the US and Batista was very detrimental to the Cuban people. And I was thrilled that President Eisenhower recognized the Castro government immediately. They were hoping to co-opt Castro and to sort of continue business as usual with the American business interests there. But very rapidly, things went south. Castro began to nationalize US businesses and institute land reform. So by the end of 59, early 60, the United States began to impose economic embargo on Cuba. And then of course we had the invasion of Cuba by the dissidents that were trained by the CIA in April of 1961. And that failed. And so the Kennedy administration continued efforts to get rid of Castro. And then a year and a half later, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of '62. And for those of you like me who lived through that and remember it, it was a very traumatic experience. I went to bed every night wondering if I would wake up. And every day I wondered if it would be my last. So that continued to pique my interest in the relationship. And then in 1974, my brother married a Cuban refugee, and she was not from a wealthy, well-to-do Cuban family that was the ones that were being really hurt by the Castro government. She was from a common family in Camagüey, Cuba. She was a school teacher, and her big issue was she did not want to teach communism to her students, which she was required to do. So she applied for a visa to go to the US, and she had to wait 6 months and endure essentially concentration camp conditions in order to get the visa. But get it, she did. She came to the US in '64 and became a factory worker first, and learned English and became an office worker. And in '74 married my brother. And they've now been married 47 years. They're happily retired in Kansas. But throughout those 47 years, as much as she hated Castro and the communist government, she hated the US embargo more, because she had a direct connection with people being hurt by the embargo, her extended family in Camagüey, Cuba. And in the last 47 years, she probably sent over $100,000 in cash and merchandise to her family to help them offset some of the problems caused by the embargo. So then in 2017, my wife and I traveled there for 10 days. It was a Rhodes Scholar people-to-people tour, which was the main way that Americans could go to Cuba, although the rest of the world was going there in great numbers. And it was, for me, a transformational experience, and it motivated me to create this talk, which I've now shared about 6 or 7 times, tonight being the first time on Zoom. So it's about 30 minutes, which gives us plenty of time to ask questions and make comments, and we will begin. We have 3 objectives: provide an overview of US-Cuba relations since 1898, understand how the Cuban Revolution of 1959 was necessary and inevitable, and stimulate interest in learning more about Cuba, its people, and the need to normalize US relations. Okay, in our first objective, we're actually going to go back to almost the beginning of the United States in 1776. US leaders always looked on Cuba with great interest. And former President Thomas Jefferson said in 1823, "I have looked upon Cuba as the most interesting addition ever to the United States." And that interesting addition meant economic interest. From a trade standpoint, Cuba is situated in a favorable trade lane, confluence of the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean Sea. It's an economic prize ripe for conquest with sugar, fish, fruit, coffee, beans, rice, potatoes, livestock, and minerals such as nickel. During the 19th century, 5 presidents sought to acquire Cuba for the US. Polk in the 1840s, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan in the 1850s, U.S. Grant in the 1870s, and they all tried to buy Cuba, which was not for sale, as it turned out. But finally, the 5th president did it. That was William McKinley, and he did it through the old tried and true means historically, which is war.
Hey, Walt, yes. I'm so sorry. Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
Someone was having trouble seeing your slides. Can you go up to, let's see, your slideshow tab at the top of your presentation and start the slideshow from this current slide? So it'll be full screen.
Okay, let me see here. I see.
So all the way up at the top where you have, yeah, your home button maybe. And then, oh, you know what? If you move over, instead of home, click on slideshow. So it's just to the right in the middle up top.
Over here?
So right up at the top of your screen, where it says home, if you move your eyes over to the center, it says slideshow. Yeah, move your cursor over a few more. You've got design, transitions, animation, slideshow.
Oh, wait, down here.
It's slideshow. Yeah.
Right there. There it is. I think I got it.
Okay. Oh, it might have taken you back to the beginning.
Okay.
No. Okay.
There we go.
All right.
Now we have the full screen on the slideshow.
Yes, we do. Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so now we've gone through the 5 presidents, and the situation was that Columbus had acquired Cuba for Spain in 1492. So Cuba was a Spanish colony. The Cubans, the native Cubans, were always chafing under Spanish rule, and they began revolting around 1868. So off and on during those 30 years, there were attempts to break away from Spain. But the US finally declared war on Spain on April 24 of 1898. There we go. And it was promoted as a mission to grant Cubans their freedom. The real agenda was to kick Spain out of the US neighborhood. That was the Monroe Doctrine from 1823. To make US an imperialist power for the first time, and to acquire economic control over Cuban wealth. Now, at this time in US history, and this is a titanic ideological battle in US history that's very neglected in our curriculum on history, and it was the promotion of imperialism by some heavyweights in US leadership. Teddy Roosevelt, the future president, his mentor, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was one of the most powerful senators, he had the drive and the interest in becoming president, but he didn't have the charisma. So he saw Teddy Roosevelt as his means of gaining power in the White House. From the media, William Randolph Hearst, one of the 2 major yellow journalists, who was constantly promoting war. And from the military, another neglected person in American history is Alfred Mahan. He was a Navy admiral. He was a terrible ship captain. He had 3 or 4 accidents with his ships, but he was a better historian. And what he did was he wrote a book in 1890, the influence of sea power upon history. which was one of the most influential books of the 19th and early 20th century. It basically advised major countries, including the United States and the Western powers and Asian powers, that the way to have empire, to be a powerful nation worldwide, was to have a powerful navy. And a lot of his thinking was incorporated by all these countries and was one of the influencers on the setting up of World War I in 1914. On the other side, there was an equally committed group of people that were against empire. They set up the Anti-Imperialist League, which included a lot of heavyweights on their side: Mark Twain, Karl Schurz, the German immigrant who became a senator and a diplomat, a leading public intellectual. There's a school named after him in Chicago. Former President Grover Cleveland, after he left the White House, during and after his time in the White House, argued against empire. Three-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. And then here's an interesting pair of bedfellows. The labor leader Samuel Gompers and his arch enemy, the industrial Andrew Carnegie, were both members of the Anti-Imperialist League, working in concert to prevent America from going to war to gain empire. And the major Black leader after the Civil War, Booker T. Washington, was part of the Anti-Imperialist League. Now, the war was easy to win. We defeated Spain in 4 months. They attempted not to provoke the US for war. They wanted to keep Cuba without engaging in war with the US, but the US main battleship that was sent to Havana Harbor to intimidate the Spanish blew up, most likely accidentally, in Havana Harbor, and it was used as a catalyst by all of the people in the Imperialist League, to the search for empire, to start war against Cuba. And that included William Randolph Hearst. He sent his photographer to Spain to get pictures of what he believed to be the upcoming war. The photographer wrote back and said, "Bill, send me home. There's not going to be a war here." And he shot back, "You give me the pictures, I'll give you the war." One of the famous quotes from that war. So in defeating Spain in 4 months, US acquired its first empire. From Spain, we acquired Cuba and Puerto Rico in Latin America. And in the Far East, we got Guam in the Philippines. And during the war, but not related directly to it, we actually acquired our first overseas possession in Hawaii in 1898. So now the war is over. We've got control of Cuba. We should have immediately given them their freedom. Not so fast. The US decided that the Cuban people were not ready for self-rule. So we retained control of Cuba for 4 years. And then there was pressure mounting to let them go. So it again set off a huge debate between the pro-empire versus anti-empire folks, whether we should keep free Cuba or keep it as an economic prize. In 1902, it was somewhat settled by the Platt Amendment to a military spending bill, which granted Cuba independence, the ability to form their own constitution with strings. And those strings were pretty heavy. The US could intervene militarily for any reason at any time. And also the US acquired under this agreement a perpetual lease to a naval base at Guantanamo Bay they set up during the war. By 1947, the UN determined that any territory acquired either by war or by intimidation after a war was invalid. But this did not apply to Guantanamo Bay because the ruling was not retroactive. So the US kept Guantanamo Bay under lease. Every year we send the Castro government about $5,000 check for our lease, and they immediately tear it up as a symbolic gesture to say that our control over Guantanamo Bay is illegal. So now we have a period of Cuban independence from 1902 to 1959, which is the era of US economic control. And we did have military interventions in the first 20 years, 1906 to 1909. In 1912, we intervened to suppress a Black rebellion of Cubans against discrimination from the non-Black Cuban populace. Our third intervention was from 1917 to 1922. Then in 1924, is a watershed year in this era because the new president, Gerardo Machado, was elected president. And this ushered in some tranquility and relative peace with the US, and we renounced future military interventions. However, because the Machado government and succeeding governments were friendly to the US economic control increased under these friendly Cuban governments. Then we get to the watershed year of 1933 and the Sergeant's Rebellion. That's Sergeant, later General Fulgencio Batista, who overthrew the elected government to take control of Cuba, and it ushered in a quarter century of his brutal rule from 1933 through 1958. And during this time, the US obtained control over the Cuban economy was completed. How complete? We siphoned off roughly the wealth of 50% of their railroads, 60% of their sugar industry, 70% of their land, 80% of their utilities, 90% of mining, and 100% of the cattle and oil industries. How dominant was the US during this period? The last US ambassador, Earl T. Smith, from 57 to 59, said the US ambassador to Cuba is the second most powerful, if not the most powerful person in Cuba, next to the Cuban president. And basically, standard procedure at this time was that the State Department issued their orders to Batista, and he followed them. Why? Because we were supplying him with tremendous military aid to suppress any dissidents to his rule. Now we get to objective two, which is to understand how the Cuban Revolution was necessary and inevitable. There we see a picture of the revolutionaries, Castro on the left, Che Guevara in the center, and Raul Castro on the right. In 1959, in the march toward victory. Now there's a prelude from 1940 to 1952. Batista, the dictator, got himself elected president in 1940 and served for 4 years. Then in 44, he took his wealth that he gleaned from the Cuban people and he retired in luxury to Cuba, and he ruled Cuba for 8 years through puppet leaders. But he got a yen to become president again. So he returned in 52 for a second run for election. However, he was running third, knew he'd lose, so he staged his second coup to retake dictatorial powers. The canceled election foiled a young lawyer's run for office. His name, Fidel Castro. And bear in mind that Castro's image in the revolutionary garb and the beard was completely antithetical to his origins. He came from a very wealthy family in Santiago. They had a huge estate. He went to the finest schools, became a lawyer, and had he chosen, he could have been a major player in the Batista government and any subsequent governments that may have followed Batista's path. But he became a revolutionary, and he decides to topple Cuba and through revolution. So a year later, in 1953, he formed a group to overthrow the Moncada Army Barracks. It was an important military installation in eastern Cuba, Santiago, and it failed miserably. So Castro, his brother Raul, Che, and others were given 15-year sentences by the Batista government. But interestingly, and this is a little bit in my mind like Hitler's 1923 beer hall putsch. It was admittedly a cockamamie scheme, and it failed miserably. And the people that instituted it were jailed. But because there was so much dissent now brewing against the Batista regime among the people, Batista felt he had to get them out of Cuba because the revulsion against Batista was rising too greatly. So he released them after 2 years, and Castro and his band fled to Cuba to plot their return. Now we get into the final 3 years. In November of 56, Castro and 81 of his revolutionaries returned to Cuba on a small boat that was only fit for about 50 people. And somehow it got through. Had it sunk, the course of history would have changed dramatically, but it landed. There was a battle with the Batista forces. Some of them were killed. They arrived on December 2nd. And, but the ones that survived, including Castro, his brother, and Che and others, went to the Sierra Maestra Mountains to join up with other revolutionary groups. And Castro, through his energy, his intelligence, his drive, and his charisma, becomes their leader. And he christens the revolution the 26th of July movement, the date of the failed 1953 Moncada Army Barracks revolt. So now we get the period after he lands in December of 56. And there's widespread attacks which begin to weaken Batista's group. Then an important date, February of 58, the US pulls its 25-year military support from Batista because they see the handwriting on the wall. So when they pull their military support from Batista, essentially that was game over for Batista at some point in the near future. So by summer, Castro goes on the offensive. In November of 58, he splits Cuba in two. It was Che Guevara leading a band at in the center of the country at Santa Clara. When we visited there, we saw the bullet marks still on some of the buildings. It was a decisive victory, and it meant the end of the Batista regime. He hung on for a month, and he fled Cuba on New Year's Eve, 58, supposedly with $300 million in plunder. So now we have the revolution, the success, on the first day of 1959. Now, the initial US reaction was favorable. Ike recognized the Castro government. At this point, there was no discussion or knowledge that he was either communist or going to align with Russia. In any event, the US hoped to co-opt Castro so that he would be not only a harbinger of democracy in Latin America, but also be agreeable to continued US influence in the Cuban economy. By April, the US became wary. He met with Nixon, who said Castro must be oriented in the right direction. And very soon, Castro begins to initiate land reforms and the appropriation of US businesses. And by the beginning of 1960, the US-Cuba honeymoon is over. Cuba nationalized US businesses. The US retaliated with their embargo, which continues to this day. And here's a really important date in US-Cuban history, March of 1960. Ike's got 10 months to go. He takes the Cuba problem from State Department and he gives it to the CIA. And the CIA doesn't do diplomacy, they do regime change. They were on a roll by 1960. They deposed Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 to protect the oil for British and US interests. They deposed Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 on the assumption he was a communist and he would create communist revolution all over Latin America. So they thought they could do no wrong. So they came to Kennedy when he just took office. He was a newbie president and said, we got this a slam dunk deal in Cuba. We're going to have 1,500 Cuban dissidents. We're going to train them. We're going to give them US planes with Cuban markings to bomb the Castro's Air Force. And the entire invasion failed immediately because Kennedy would not have a second bombing to finish taking out the Cuban Air Force, and he would not send US ground troops. And the CIA was counting on that. They thought there was no way Kennedy would back out once the invasion had started. And that set off a battle royal between Kennedy and the CIA. He's famously said he wanted to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He fired Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA. And then, of course, we have, during the next year and a half, continued efforts under the Operation Mongoose plan from the CIA, which was also helped by people in the administration, to assassinate Castro. And there were at least 5 attempts to assassinate him, hoping that that would trigger some kind of a response to oust the communist regime. Now we get to the October 62 missile crisis, and my reading is that the primary reason the missiles were put there was to be a get out of evasion free card for Cuba and for Russia to counter our missiles on his doorstep in Turkey. It backfired on Castro, but we came so close to nuclear war. I mean, there was miracle after miracle that prevented it, for those of you that weren't around then, that Kennedy and Khrushchev both had an epiphany and started communicating with each other secretly to end the Cold War. And part of ending the Cold War was ending the embargo and Cold War against Cuba. So we get to 1963, a year and a month after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuban is seeking détente with Castro. He can't do it publicly because he would be crucified by the national security state, the CIA, the FBI, the military. So he uses non-military back channel persons. And one of the persons was Jean Daniel, a French journalist. He meets with Daniel on October 24th of 63, 28 days before his assassination. And he says to Daniel, there is no country where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, owing in part to my country's policies during the Batista regime. It is as though Batista was the incarnation of sins on the part of the US. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. So here we see a kind of schizophrenic Kennedy on Cuba. On the one hand, he's greenlighting the invasion formed by the CIA and trying to assassinate him after the invasion failed. And on the other hand, he really realizes full well that the Cuban Revolution was necessary and inevitable. His assassination, one of the bad aspects of the many bad aspects was that possibly we would have had détente with Cuba within 4 years of the embargo starting in 1960. Castro was always hoping to have détente with the US. So he reached out to LBJ in 64, but was rebuffed. Then in 1981, Reagan comes in, he tightens the embargo. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and this ushered in the special period for Cuba. And by special, it means they were starving to death because they had the US embargo on the one hand, and they lost the aid they were getting from the Soviet Union, which had collapsed. This begins now, Cuba begins to, on a very limited basis, start free enterprise. And when we went there in 2017, the free enterprise was listed as about 1/3 of their economy. 1993, George H.W. Bush comes in and he tightens the embargo. 96, Clinton makes the trade embargo permanent. Then we get to the administration of George W. Bush, and he really escalates it. He tightens the embargo. He calls Cuba an outpost of tyranny. He sets up a $140 million propaganda campaign against the government, tightened travel restrictions, and he created a commission for the assistance to free Cuba. All of this was designed to hasten regime change that started back at the end of 59, early 60. Now we get to another watershed year in the history, which is 2008. Castro resigns due to ill health. He's replaced by brother Raul, so no big changes in the government. Obama is elected, and he is the first president to outwardly say we need to have détente with Cuba. He would like to reestablish diplomatic relations with them and end the embargo. He really can't do much during his first term. He did ease travel restrictions a bit, allowed internet access for the US and Cuba to solve mutual problems. But in his second term, now he doesn't have to worry about re-election. So in his first full year of the second term, he meets with Raul Castro at the Mandela Memorial in South Africa, where they begin the discussion. Now it's no longer back channel, it's out in the open. Next year, Cuba and the US announce a framework to resume diplomatic relations, eventually to end the embargo. The next year, January, further trade is allowed. In April, Cuba is removed from the terrorist sponsor list, which is a prerequisite to having diplomatic relations restored. And in July, those diplomatic relations are restored with embassies opened in their respective capital. And in his last full year in office, 2016, Obama was the first president to visit Cuba since 1924, and that was Calvin Coolidge. There is Obama with Raul Castro, wearing suits, not revolutionary fatigues. Another watershed year was 1917 when Trump came to office. And basically Trump dealt with Cuba like he dealt with almost every good, decent thing Obama did. He says, it's no good, I gotta overturn it. So he said the Cuba deal was terrible. He reimposed travel restrictions. He lumped Cuba into his troika of tyranny list with Venezuela and Nicaragua because they were socialist. He's raising the bogeyman of socialism, which continues to this day in the Republican Party under Trump, and overall tensions were heightened considerably. 2021, this year, Joe Biden is the newly elected president. During the campaign, he promised to resume détente, which he contributed to as Obama's vice president. But he comes in and he reneges on his promise and he continues Trump's economic sanctions. He even adds new sanctions on Cuban officials over the massive demonstrations in Havana over the COVID problems. And what I submit is that he is pandering to the Florida Cuban population to stay competitive for the Democrats, whoever that may be, in 24. Now, if Florida had 9 electoral votes instead of 29 votes, this probably wouldn't happen. But I think they're over exaggerating the threat of losing Florida unless they demonize the Cuban communist government. Obama won Cuba twice. He won Florida twice by 1.8% in 2008 and by 0.9% in 2012. And so that really busted the myth that you had to demonize Cuba to win Florida. Trump comes in and he reverses that. He wins in Florida by 1.2 percentage points in 2016, and he almost triples it to 3.3% in 2020. How much of that was due to his charisma with the Republican base, I think has quite a bit to do with it. So I really disagree with the notion that to win Florida, you have to maintain the embargo and maintain a hard line against Cuba. So that completes the overview of Cuba from 1898 to present regarding its relationship with the US. And now we get to objective 3, which is to stimulate interest in learning more about Cuba, its people, and the need to normalize US-Cuba relations. If at all, and some of you may have, hopefully, visit Cuba, it's harder, but it is still possible under the Trump-Biden era restrictions. Most of the travel is done through tour groups under what's called people-to-people cultural exchange. That is allowed by the US government. It's very difficult for individuals to travel, but I understand if you have the wherewithal, you can still do it. I'm going to recommend a book if you have any interest in this titanic battle between the pro-empire and the anti-empire people in the 1890s. It's called The True Flag, T.R. Mark Twain, and the Birth of American Empire by Stephen Kinzner. Excellent book. I'm also going to recommend regarding the epiphany that Trump and that Kennedy and Khrushchev had after the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, and also the efforts that Kennedy made to initiate détente with Cuba. And it's called JFK and the Unspeakable: Why He Died and Why It Matters by James W. Douglas. JFK and the Unspeakable, an excellent book, really deals with the assassination, but the part that I'm emphasizing is Kennedy and Khrushchev's combined efforts to end the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy's efforts to have détente with Cuba in his second term. And if you don't already, I would urge you to support efforts to end the embargo and normalize US-Cuba relations. The embargo is federal law, so it cannot be done unilaterally by the president. It has to be an act of Congress. So to sum up, the US controlled, exploited Cuba for 61 years, 1898 to 1959. Cuban Revolution of 1959 was necessary and inevitable. After 62 years, the US embargo and opposition to Cuban Revolution continues. Cuba and the Cuban people deserve better. And to get back to the subtitle of the talk, we weren't told the truth about the 1898 war that ceded Cuba to the US. We weren't told the truth about the brutal quarter-century Batista regime that allowed US to siphon off Cuban wealth. We weren't told the truth about the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We haven't been told the truth about the need to end the cruel Cuban economic embargo. And perhaps our schools, our media, and our government never will. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Walt. All right. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type those into the chat or the Q&A, and I will monitor those questions as they come in. But I do have a question for Walt while we're waiting for people to go ahead and type. So I remember when things opened up and people were allowed to start to travel again, there was so much talk about tourism, you know, not just because it would be so beneficial to the Cuban economy, but also because Americans had been prevented from going there for so long that it was almost like a time capsule.
Yes.
So could you talk a little bit about tourism, how it is today, what maybe, you know, the goal is for tourism and how that will impact the economy?
Well, tourism is a huge, it's important to the Cuban economy. Under Obama, I understand upwards of 500,000 Americans visited Cuba, and now that was greatly reduced when Trump got in and continuing under Biden. So we can't blame it all on Trump, but the rest of the world is visiting Cuba. And what is startling when we were in Cuba was that there is reconstruction going on everywhere. And all the machinery is Russian, Chinese, Italian, French, English, you know, British. Not a single piece of equipment is made in USA. The new cars are coming in. There's still thousands of the garachos, they call them. These are the US cars that were cut off in '61. The last model year that's on Cuban streets is a '61. It came in 1960. And it's just stunning to think of the economic waste to the US. It's an opportunity that we're just simply throwing away out of inertia and out of fear of alienating this so-called anti-communist group of people in Florida. That, but they're about 2 or 3 generations removed from the original folks that came over. So the level of anger against the communist regime there has greatly dissipated. And again, that's why I think Obama was able to win Florida twice. And I think a Democratic candidate can win in 24 if Trump's not on the ballot by reaching out to Cuba rather than demonizing it. So it's just sad that the US tourism is down and that no US economic interests can take advantage of the opportunities there.
Yeah, let's hope if things do open up again and we can go back and visit, that more people will be interested in doing that and supporting the Cuban people. I have a question about the government. So from the time of when Spain was in control until today, has corruption been an issue with the government in Cuba?
I understand that it is, but I do not have much detailed information on the level of corruption. The Cuban government is not considered to be a well-run government overall, and it's still very authoritative. Now, when we were there, we didn't see any police on the streets, and we were walking around Havana at night, somewhat late, and the vibe was extremely peaceful. So we had no sense that there's anger in the general populace from our visit there in 2017.
Okay. So I guess I also was wondering a little bit about Guantanamo Bay. Could you explain how it's possible for us to have that control over that piece of Cuba?
Well, it's a power. It's because of our power. If the Cubans had the power to kick us out, they would, and they demand that we leave every year. And the UN says that our stay there is illegal and unwarranted, but we simply thumb our nose at both the Cuban government and the United Nations, and we stay there. And again, it's something that under today's UN edicts, a country cannot from war, either take land or take land from intimidation. So we're gonna literally be there as long as we want. There's no power that can stop us from keeping the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, and it's gotten infamy as the prison for terrorists, alleged terrorists after 9/11. There's still 39 people there. There were over, I think, 800 at one point, but it's down to 39. And we're spending something like $13 million a year on each of those 39 people to keep them there.
Wow, that's incredible. All right, so my final question, and we still have some time if anyone wants to type anything in, is the Castro that is in charge right now, is that Raul still?
No, Raul stepped down officially from all roles in the party. The new president is Miguel Diaz-Canel. And Raul is in his 90s. He's more of a titular figure. I don't think he's very active at all in Cuban government, probably zero. He's just considered a revered figure of the revolution from 1959.
But overall, the Castro's policies haven't changed. It's just a different person in charge.
Correct. It's still a communist government. It's officially a communist government. They have elections to a national assembly. It's interesting, when we were there, when they have the elections, the only advertising a candidate can do is a poster that they put in the window of a store with their picture and a description of what their policies will be. But there's no ability to overturn the Communist Party. It's still essentially a one-party rule.
Okay, wow. There's definitely a lot that I never learned about Cuba in school. All right, well, it looks like we're out of time. Thanks so much, Walt, for being with us. And we are recording this, so we'll be putting it up on YouTube in a few days.
Thank you very much, Christina.
All right,
Good
take
evening.
care, everyone.
Good night.